Awesome. So I'm really excited to welcome everybody today to this event, which is featuring Michele Friedner, Ruth Osorio, and Victor Zhuang. And we're so glad that all of you could be here today to think together with us. As we offer welcoming remarks for this event, we're going to have slides in the background for a good portion of our discussion. And this current slide features the title of the event, as well as logos for the DISCO Network, the Digital Studies Institute, and the Digital Accessible Futures Lab, which are event sponsors. And while we're also waiting for others to join, we're going to just give a few guidelines for today's discussion. So first, if you have an access or technology related concern or question, you can direct message or chat Giselle Mills, who is one of the co-hosts on Zoom. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or if the Q&A feature is populating on your end, you can use that as well. We do ask that to just respect everybody's privacy on the call, that folks don't record on their own or live tweet anything, that we kind of keep things situated in this space. So with that, I'm going to temporarily turn the baton over to David Edelman.
Hello, everyone. So we're going to begin with the land acknowledgement. The University of Michigan is built on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, as well as the Wyandot. Today, we benefit from access to land and resources originally gained through a coercive treaty that was supposed to ensure reciprocity, mutual respect, and access to education. Disability justice necessarily includes dismantling settler colonialism and white supremacy. It means dismantling the racist and ableist belief that the white settler body mind is the most capable and valuable. We also want to begin today by attending to access. We'd like to take a few moments to attend to access in this virtual space. Please come to today's session as you are, and feel free to enter and exit the space as you need to. You can access CART and real-time captioning by clicking on the, CC button at the bottom menu of Zoom during the discussion later. Those of you on Zoom can enter your questions in the Q&A feature of the platform. This event has been organized by the Digital Accessible Futures Lab and DISCO Network, which receives funding from the Mellon Foundation. The DISCO stands for Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism. The DISCO Network integrates critical humanistic, social science, and artistic approaches to digital studies and foregrounds questions about the cultural implications of technology to envision a new anti-racist and anti-ableist digital future. If you like, you can learn more about DISCO at disconetwork.org or locate the DISCO Network on Twitter. As well, the Digital Accessible Futures Lab focuses on pressing issues at the intersection of disability liberation, techno-ableism, neuroqueer activism, and critical accessibility studies. Our URL is http://accessiblefutures.net. And we will now transition to introducing today's wonderful speakers. Thank you again.
Hello, this is Remy speaking again. So I have the really great pleasure of introducing our panelists. So first is Michele Friedner, who is a professor and chair in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. Michele is a medical anthropologist and works at the intersections of medical anthropology, science and technology studies, disability studies, deaf studies, and sensory studies. Her most recent book is Sensory Futures, Deafness and Cochlear Implant Infrastructures. And she's excited to talk about the sensory and other infrastructures of academic conferences. And then the out text for Michele's headshot on the screen reads, a middle-aged white woman with reddish hair in a black jacket stands in front of a slightly fuzzy purple flowered tree, making a lopsided power pose. Next is Ruth Osorio, who is an associate professor of English and Women's and Gender Studies at Old Dominion University. Ruth is a feminist rhetorician who researches disability activism, critical access literacies, and feminist historiography. She has researched and participated in disability access advocacy at the Conference on College Composition and Communication, also known as the 4Cs, and the Feminisms and Rhetoric Conference. Outside of work, she's a troop leader for a large LGBTQIA affirming Girl Scout troop in Norfolk, an avid reader of novels, and a lover of nature. And then the alt text for Ruth's headshot on the screen is a white middle-aged woman stands in front of a full bookshelf and smiles at someone off to the side. And then next we have Hwansong Victor Zhuang, who's an assistant professor in disability communication in the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information at Nanyang Technical University, Singapore. Victor is a disability studies scholar working at the intersections of disability, media, cultural, and communication studies, and his research focuses on disability and inclusion in contemporary societies such as Singapore. He's also exploring questions of digital inclusion, in particular, the socio-technical imaginaries of disability in emerging tech, and the intersections of sustainable futures and disability in smart cities. And then the alt text for Victor's headshot is an Asian presenting man with black hair smiling at the camera. He is wearing a pair of metal rimmed spectacles and a gray sweater over a white collared shirt. So now I'm just going to briefly take a moment to describe the discussion format for today. So we're going to begin the roundtable discussion by posing a few questions, and panelists will take some time to respond and discuss with each other. I should note that these questions were generated by students as well as early career faculty, and they're meant to get our conversation jump-started. From there, we want to move to a broader conversation with all of you who are attending. So as we go, you can use the chat. If the Q&A feature is showing for you, you can use that as well to pose any questions you'd like the panelists to take up in conversation, and we'll keep a record of what people are asking as we go. And we'll do our best to move through as many questions as we can in the allotted time. You can also use the chat to discuss and ask things with each other as well. So with that, for our first question, I'm going to turn things over to David and our panelists.
So thank you again. So our first question that I would like to pose for the panel, and I'm very excited about this, is how do you think about disability and accessibility in your work defined broadly? So for example, activism, scholarship, creative work, teaching, or community care. What are some ways of thinking about disability that have guided your practice, your work, your scholarship? Thank you.
This is Ruth. Shall I go first? Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I want to start just by thanking all of the folks, the disco folks. I'm really excited to be here. I was meant to be at a disco talk in 2023 and I couldn't make it. And so this feels actually like very healing and really great to be here today. I love this first question. So I like to study and research and think about disability activism. And so a lot of my understanding of accessibility doesn't come from the legal realm or the educational realm, but instead how activists talk about themselves, their lived experiences, and how they feel a sense of accessibility and that intimacy that Mia Mingus talks about as well. So I think of disability as a lived experience and a source of knowledge making. And how that relates to conferences, I guess we'll talk about that soon, but is that conferences are such an exciting generative space for people to come and share ideas. And everyone who has cool ideas should be able to share, and we all benefit when we can learn from each other. I think about accessibility and disability through a lot of the lenses of the activists I study. Nothing about us without us, which is like a core mantra of disability rights, the idea that disabled people are the experts of what is accessibility, what is access, what their mind bodies need to feel not just able to access a space, but also to participate in ways that they feel, that everyone feels like they can participate in how they choose, whether that is engaging, observing, leading, co-leading. So that's a big part of it. I also think about disability through an intersectional lens, and I think about it especially with expansive access. At a conference that the 4Cs, which was mentioned earlier, that is the Conference on College Composition and Communication. There was an issue in the 2024 conference in which Black Cs members were racially profiled at the entrance. And that to me is a accessibility issue because some people were not able to access the space in the same ways that their white counterparts were. And so thinking about bathroom access, which impacts disabled people, caregivers, and trans and non-binary folks. So thinking about access really intersectionally and expansively. And I also, going back to the activists, thinking about community care and collective care as ways to create access when our institutions fail, which they do.
So, okay, I'm Victor, and thank you, Michelle. I'll go next, and thank you, Ruth. I wanted to also start by acknowledging and thanking the unseen labor that goes into making the conference possible. So Remy, Giselle, Patricia, David, Cherise, Annette, our captioner, they do so much work in, getting and organizing and, having captions. I mean, these are just unseen labor. And I think a lot of it that guides my thinking about how conferences can be made accessible, how I think about disability in my work is about labor, isn't it? And I'm saying this also because I recognize that a lot of times, a lot of the organizing goes on behind the scenes, right? We don't see it, but that's important to think about. So acknowledging that labor, acknowledging the care that goes into the labor, right, is important. And that is something that also guides my practice. I think a lot of my own sort of thinking about disability comes from my own journey and interaction with folks at the Department of Human Development and Disability at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I started my PhD with Leonard Davis in 2017. And I will acknowledge that when I started in the fall of 2017, I don't think I knew a lot about disability and accessibility in the ways that we are talking about now. So I must trace that origin to the work I've done as a teaching assistant for a large undergraduate course, which was titled DHD 101 Disability in US Society, taught by Lieke Van Humen, and also now Koneski. So that's Liekevanhumen, Lieke Van Humen, and now Koneski, Nellkoneczny. So Lieke and Nell had done a complete redesign of the course, and they attempted to center disability in pedagogy for 2017, the year that I joined. And they've written an article published in the Journal of Teaching Disability Studies, which I will share in the link shortly. So I will attribute a lot of the fundamental thinking about disability and accessibility to my involvement with this course, which I was a part of for, I think, 4 semesters. And I think if there's one principle that I will hold to in thinking about accessibility in conferences, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, is that I would say that we shouldn't pretend to know everything, that accessibility shouldn't be that standard that we aspire to. It should be the baseline from which we all start from. So we need to be thinking about how we can move on from that baseline and be supportive, be accommodative, be flexible, be open to folks' access needs, and to talk about how we can resolve issues from there. I will talk about some of these issues in my experience trying to organize international conferences, which brings in a whole different ballgame altogether.
Okay, should I go now? Okay, thank you. It's so nice to follow Vic, who I've known for a while from his days at UIC, and it's nice to meet you, Ruth. And thank you so much to all the coordinators of this. And I also want to say I love the way that you guys started this webinar and this mentoring session in terms of like welcoming us to the space and with the access statement. So thank you so much for that. So in terms of thinking about disability and accessibility in my work, so I work mostly as an anthropologist. I work in India and Pakistan most recently. And, you know, and I work with parents and I work with medical providers and speech and language therapists. And so it's really been interesting for me to think about how do I think about access in these spaces. And something that I really like to think about is, so for example, I attended a conference as part of my work. So it was a conference on cochlear implants in India. It was sponsored by the Cochlear Implant Group of India. And I was the only deaf person at that conference. There were no other cochlear implant users. And that conference was largely inaccessible to me, and I'm saying it in quotes, in the sense that I had no idea, for the most part, what people were saying during their panel presentations. I mean, if I sat in the front and looked at the PowerPoints and so on, I could follow. This was in 2018, so it was before Otter AI and those other devices or other apps were quite sort of present. And so and I thought a lot about, what would happen if I brought an ASL interpreter or another interpreter to this conference? What kinds of access might be ruptured? If I brought the interpreter, what types of access would be foreclosed? And I decided, okay, fine, I'm going to go to this conference and I brought a student with me from U Chicago, and we would meet in between the presentations and compare notes. And I recorded some of the sessions and got them transcribed. But this was a really interesting example of me foregoing access in perhaps the normative sense in order to form other forms of access with people at the conference during the breaks and during the receptions. And then there was another time when I went to a parents meeting for an organization, and this organization was a organization for deaf children that was profoundly completely oral. They did not support or encourage the use of Indian Sign Language or any sign language at all. And I actually wanted to bring an interpreter to that event for me. And so I went to the director of that organization and said, can I bring an interpreter to the event? And he said, yes, you can. But to be clear, that interpreter is only for you, not for anyone else. So I said, fine, and I brought the interpreter. And this to me was a really interesting example of, okay, so I'm kind of sneaking the interpreter in. The parents who are at this workshop or at this meeting are going to see the interpreter. Maybe it'll plant a seed that there are other things that are possible, for their kids. So I feel like I think a lot about access, access to myself and access for other people when I'm in the field. On my last trip to Pakistan, my first and only and last trip to Pakistan in December, I did something which I really enjoyed, which was because I had these meetings with pretty influential people in terms of deaf and hard of hearing healthcare and early intervention for deaf children. And so I decided that I was going to ask the head of a deaf school in Karachi to go to all of the meetings with me. And to sort of tag team because he had an agenda which I supported. His agenda was to, increase awareness and to increase resources going to Pakistani Sign Language. And so I brought him with me and we went to all the meetings together and it was super fun actually to tag team. And I felt like, I was able to, help him also formulate relationships with people, which I really appreciated. So I think, just to go to the question, like I feel like working in contexts in which the way that we think about accessibility in the US is not the norm is something that I often have to negotiate. Like when do I foreground my own individual access? When do I background it? When do I make demands on research participants and organizations? When do I not? Um, and again, this is all very much, you know, bundled up with the fact that I do have listening and speaking privileges. There are people, and I've talked with other deaf researchers, there are researchers who would not be able to do that, and that would not be an option for them. And I'm very aware of that. So, yeah. So that was a rambling answer, but thank you.
This is Remy speaking. No, not rambling at all. And thank you, Michelle, Vic, and Ruth for kicking us off. So I am just going to pose question number 2, which has a couple of different parts from participants. So when it comes to presenting at conferences, what strategies have you used to create access? What suggestions do you have for those who are working to make their conference presentations more accessible? And how can we overall improve accessibility in virtual conference spaces?
So I'd be happy to start, if that's okay, because I just finished. So thank you. So first of all, I just want to say I hate conferences for the most part. And I have had lots of really terrible experiences with conferences. Starting from when I was a grad student, I had lots and lots of fights, literal fights, with the Society for Applied Anthropology and the American Anthropological Association around providing access at conferences. And I think both conferences have gotten better over time in terms of providing access. What's interesting is that the AAAs, the American Anthropological Association, is now super top down and it's really box checky. And it's really interesting too to see who is actually doing the labor and who isn't. And so, yeah, so I hate conferences. And when I go to conferences, I do not have high expectations. And I think of conferences as places to go and see people who I want to see and to make new connections. So I think of a conference very differently than as the conference is intended. I was talking recently with a colleague and she's like, oh, I really like to just pick new panels and go and sit in those panels and learn new things. And I was like, ha. That is not something that I've ever done at a conference. I have to be very strategic about what panels I go to. I need to contact the panelists in advance, see if they're going to have access copies, get there, get the access copies, sit in the front of the room. It takes a lot of work. And so instead, what I've been doing is I've been thinking, okay, who do I want to meet at this conference? What do I want to do? Who do I want to hang out with? And it's not networking per se, because networking sounds really soulless and opportunistic to me, but it's more like using the space of this conference as an opportunity to make connections with people who I've wanted to make connections with and people who I've thought about meeting for a while. So for me, I do not approach a conference as a conference, and I really do think that the constraints of traditional conferences are such that make them inherently inaccessible. So my strategies are to not think of them as, they're supposed to be used for. And then in terms of making spaces or conference presentations more accessible, I think we need to radically rethink what we mean by presentation, end quote. In my discipline in anthropology, people tend to read papers. And there's also, a reason why people do that in terms of accessibility. Yes, reading a paper can potentially be more accessible for the person reading it if English isn't their first language, if they are experiencing other types of challenges or ways of engaging that don't, go well with talking off the cuff, you know. But for me, I really think we need to rethink what we do in a conference presentation, and that means not taking a chapter and trying to read it. It means not trying to do so much, and I think it really means that we have to rethink about how we engage with people. So I have been trying really hard in my own work, A, not to read, B, to be realistic about what it is that I can convey in that time, and then C, I think it's really important to approach the conference presentation as something that you do prepare for. There's the joke about how we sit on the plane and we write our talk, but no, I really think that's deeply problematic. And we do need to do things further in advance, in order to take it seriously, which I realize might be totally contradictory or totally contradicting what I said in my first part about not going to presentations, but yeah, take our presentation seriously. And then in terms of virtual spaces, I think virtual spaces are often the most accessible spaces for me in terms of actual content of presentations, in the sense that the speaker is right there. We have at least auto captions. They are manageable in a way, but then again, they're not accessible in a lot of other ways in terms of engaging with people. So yeah, that was again a rambling response, but yes, I hate conferences.
Maybe I can go next after Michelle. This is Victor speaking. So I'll probably address the third part of the question, which is how can we improve accessibility in virtual conference spaces, more like hybrid, and drawing from my experience trying to organize a hybrid conference recently. So at the International Communications Association for the past, I think, 3 years, 2020, for the past 2 years or so, a group of disability scholars have been trying to come together and, try to organize around disability at ICA, International Comms Association. And so I've been delighted to be working with disability scholars like Jared Goggin, Katie Ellis, Maria Alper, Liz Elsasor, Beth Heller, Remy as well, Remy Agu, and many others. And I think the challenge for us is that one, ICA is an international organization. It's a huge organization. It's more like 13, 15, 20 sub organizations within one big umbrella organization. And the membership is from across the world. So when we decided to organize around disability, we wanted to try to bring in disability principles, offer hybrid options for folks, because we realized that coming to the Gold Coast for this year's conference in June 2024 was going to be expensive to folks. So that was what we set out to do, right? We wanted to make it low cost, accessible. But I think for us, there was a lot of labor that went into trying to meet that. And a lot of the credit must go to two graduate students, Wen-Qi, who's at UC, and Valkyria Ramos, who's at Universitas Pontificia or something like that. I check it out and I'll put it in the chat. I'm so sorry for not getting that right. So both of them worked very hard to try to, one, find out, once we got the participants ready, right, for the pre-conference, for the hybrid conference, we went to folks and asked them to give their time zones that they were going to be presenting if they were not going to be on the Gold Coast in person. So we had, I think, across 30 odd presenters. I think at last count, 9 different time zones that we had to juggle with. So basically, it was a matter of sorting folks in to the right time, organizing, trying to ensure that folks weren't presenting at 2 a.m. in the morning, 5 a.m. in the morning, get that kind of thing. And when we really couldn't and had to schedule people at like 6 a.m., we offered folks the option of pre-recording and then just zooming in at the same time. So I think that's fundamental, right? Checking with people, making sure that people are engaged, meeting their access needs, and that is sort of key in improving accessibility in virtual conference spaces, especially when you deal with an international audience. Ruth, over to you.
Thank you, Vic. This is Ruth. Hi. I approached this question in a couple ways, and I think in some ways I'm going to be crabby contrarian, which, you know, very much suits my tearful personality. Okay, so I think just like very practically, when I looked at this question, I was like, here are some best practices that I use when I am preparing for a conference. Very much like the wonderful folks at Disco modeled, I love an access invitation in the beginning of a panel to invite people to utilize the space in ways that feel nurturing for their mind body. And I think that's something I really like hearing that in virtual spaces too, even just the permission, like, hey, you can turn off your video and I won't be offended. Or, you know, those kind of invitations to name it. I do access copies. And in fact, something I started giving myself permission to do is to not make, if I have limited time, focus on the access copy and not making a pretty slide. I used to feel like I had to have a really pretty slideshow to go with it. And then I found that my attention being kind of divided between the two. In person, always using mics, describing visuals. So I was thinking about this in terms of just very practical elements, but I also want to think about it more largely and speaking to some of the themes that Michele brought up, which is, okay, I wrote it down because I like to jot down. So I'm putting up my index card with hearts and cursive messy. And in order to explode the conference presentation, we need to explode larger notions of what counts as knowledge making. And I'm sorry, this is going to be like my soapbox, but conferences are in this larger ecosystem of what counts as knowledge making. And so I think about this question about how to present, how to approach. It's going to be different for graduate students who are thinking about going on the job market, pre-tenure people who these are really high stakes situations. And for people to feel comfortable to explode and create and be weird and divergent in these spaces, we also need to rethink about how we have conversations. And now that I'm tenured as of July, when you're sitting on the hiring committee, are you thinking about creative works and personal writing and weird divergent maybe presentations or performances in the same way that you're thinking about reading from a paper talks? And I think until we do that work, and also in the tenure committees as well, until we do that work of rethinking what counts as knowledge making, it can be risky to take these risks in the conference space. And so when we think about conferences, there are specific and unique challenges. Margaret Price, PRICE, talks about these as kairotic spaces where and kairotic is KAIROTIC. So kairotic spaces in that it might seem like it's informal, especially like in between sessions when you're just moving from one space to another, but actually it's all high stakes because we are being in some ways it feels like observed by future colleagues, by future chairs. And so much of the work I feel like we have to do is to just continue rethinking and what counts as knowledge in academia. And I think that would help a lot in making it accessible. And then also my other thing I've been thinking a lot about is I do think there's an assumption that accessibility, virtual spaces are inherently more accessible. And I want to complicate that too. And it's for so many different reasons. For so many people, it is more accessible, especially financially, if you have limited travel funds or if you travel with a companion. Travel in itself is an accessibility issue, and virtual helps mitigate that. On the other hand, there are other accessibility issues that come from the virtual experience. I have 2 young children at home, and so whenever there's a virtual conference, I don't have space to like go and actually like check in. I do have an office, but it's windowless, and so I don't like to be in here for more than 2 hours because otherwise I get sad. So, for me, during those days of virtual conferences, I'm so happy there was some way to engage during those lockdown and quarantine times. But at the same time, it was really hard for me to lock in and focus with the chaos of children who like just have so many needs. They have so many. And so for me, actually physically going to another space helps a lot. And then also I have audio processing disorders. So conferences in general are just a challenge for me with that whole part of sitting and just listening. And so I really appreciate, and this can be done virtually too, access copies and different ways where I can more visually follow along. So I have my captions on. I'm so grateful for those. So also rambly, but rethink what counts as knowledge, learn and practice the best practices. I'll put a link into the chat, Composing Access, which has just a wealth of resources about preparing your presentation. And then also just doing that hard work.
So this is David speaking again with our next question. So what suggestions do you have for disabled folks who are navigating conference attendance and inaccessibility? How does one navigate inaccessibility in the high stakes terrain that is often the conference for many of the same reasons that Ruth just laid out for us?
So I would say this is Michelle. So I'm speaking as somebody with tenure, and again, as a white, listening and speaking deaf person who increasingly identifies as deaf disabled for other reasons. So I think it's really important to pick your battles. So as a graduate student and as a pre-tenure faculty, I really was in these fights with the Society for Applied Anthropology and with the American Anthropological Association. And those fights were super stressful and did not feel very good. And I still have a lot of anger directed at those organizations. And so I think it's really important to pick your battles and to really think about what are the aspects of that conference that will feel most important and nourishing and productive for you. So if there is that panel that you really want to go to, focus on that. If there are those people that you really want to meet with, prioritize that. So I really do think that it's about prioritizing and also realizing and setting yourself up for the fact that you are going to be going to a space that isn't entirely accessible. And I just wanted to share something that I found really interesting. So last year I went to the 4S, the Society for the Social Studies of Science conference, and the organizers had put together this beautiful booklet. It was in Hawaii, and they had put together this beautiful booklet about how to do appropriate land acknowledgements, and then also how to do accessible panels and presentations. It was super thoughtful in many ways. And the only panels that actually did this stuff were the disability panels, the panels that specifically had people working on disability as part of the panels. The rest of them just completely ignored it. And it's interesting to think about, who monitors this and who does the work of making sure that these things happen. And I was just thinking about what Ruth was saying about, putting in the work, and what Victor was also saying about labor. So there's so many different kinds of labor that go into creating these conference spaces. And I guess the question is like, what do we do, as academics more broadly to recognize that labor and to ourselves put in the labor of working to make these spaces more accessible. So my suggestions are manage expectations and to fight for the things that you think are important and really strategize. And I think for me, navigating inaccessibility and high stakes terrain. So, I've walked out of panels. I've just said these are not accessible, and I've walked out. And I did do that as a pre-tenure person. And I've also, made the time to just say, okay, I'm gonna go and find a really cool restaurant in this city, and go to that restaurant. Or I'm gonna go for a walk. Or I'm going to do something else other than the conference. So I gave myself breaks, and I gave myself permission to take those breaks, And I will say, it's interesting because we do talk about these um, conferences as high stakes spaces, and they are high stakes in the sense that sometimes job interviews can take place. They're high stakes in the sense that a senior person can come and see your presentation. They're high stakes in the sense that you could somehow fuck up so badly that people are going to remember it forever. But what I have found is, especially in the larger conferences, there are these places where people are really anonymous, and it's really hard actually to be recognized or to be noticed. And so what I've been trying to do is to not see them as high stakes, which I know again it's easier for some people to do and not others. And I think going to what Ruth was saying about how expensive it is to go to conferences, there are all kinds of costs that are involved. Yes.
This is Victor speaking. I was just going to second Michelle's idea or suggestion of or advice to go for dinner. I do that all the time. So it's just recalling, I was telling Remy at ICA on Gold Coast, like I also hate conferences. I hate being in large crowds. I just don't know what to do in large crowds. I'm happy to meet one-on-one all the time. I was going to say that also maybe we like to think of conferences as being overrated. So taking Michelle's advice that conferences are not that high stake after all. And also thinking about my own experience getting a job in academia. I think a lot of my opportunities that came about not because of me presenting at conferences, but because I've been sort of pretty shameless in writing emails to people to say, look, I'm here at this conference, can we go for coffee? Can we meet one-on-one? And I function better in one-on-one meetings than in one-to-many kind of speaking engagements. So it's kind of weird that I'm here today too. But so the other thing that I was going to say is this question of, I think as Michelle and Ruth were speaking, and I've sort of going back to Michelle's earlier point of thinking about being sort of international and comparing that to the American experience. So for me as a non-American, I think a lot of times there's no recourse to legislation or rights or ADA. So I would think that a lot of times the way to navigate conference would be to ask and not to fight. So fighting is not commonplace for me, right? When I see issues, we don't fight. We ask nicely, and sometimes that happens. And sometimes people might offer access just because we ask, and we never knows. I think it's problematic, of course, that we need to ask, but in the lack of recourse of rights and legislation, sometimes we just have to work with whatever tools we have. So I would think that's one advice I would give as well.
Thank you. This is Ruth. I'm putting that resource in the chat. Thank you, Christy, for the nudge. I would say my yes, echo all of this. And I appreciate, Michelle, what you said, because I will say it feels really high stakes. I remember as a graduate student and as someone who now mentors graduate students, I think a lot of students go to conferences and feel like they have to do all the things, and you do not. I never go to more than 1 or 2 panels a day. I take lots of breaks. And I think giving yourself permission to do that is really key. And the big thing I was going to say that Michelle mentioned in the chat is find your people. Find your people. The first time I went to SEAS, that's the big writing studies conference, it was so overwhelming. I didn't identify as disabled, but I had my newborn with me and my partner. We all traveled together. And I remember walking into the disability studies standing group. And immediately when the invitation, that access invitation was read, just feeling so at home, which is such a rare experience at conferences. And it was the first time I felt comfortable. I just like nursed my baby like at the space, because even though, you know, we were talking about disability access, it just felt like a space for belonging for multiple forms of access. And it was really so great. And when you find your people, whether that is, you know, finding the disability studies caucus or group, if there is one in a larger conference, I mean, it's great to have this shared academic interest, but it also means that you can Crip hack access as needed. So when the institution fails, community prevails. And so when you find your people and you go and even at a well-meaning conference where there is CART, but it's just not working at that time, friends can help set up Otter and other forms of technology. When you are trying to find a restroom that matches your gender identity and you want to feel safe, having a friend who will be there and keep watch, or just these ways of creating access together in a more intimate small group setting. And that is, I think, my biggest recommendation, because even well-meaning conference organizations, they can't decide on the space. They can't create the virtual infrastructure. And so when you have your people, and then the question is, how do I find them? You know, disability studies subgroups are great. Back before Twitter was overrun by back when Twitter was Twitter, that was a great place just to meet people. If anyone here ever goes to 4Cs or FemRets, I can be your people. Talking to your mentors and having them introduce you to people. These are all ways to create community, so that when you go to the spaces and you do ask, or let's say you've asked or you've fought for your access from the organizers, and it's still not where it needs to be for you to feel fully included, you can still have a sense of belonging with your people.
Hello, this is David again, up with our next question, rather, and that is, what is the most innovative accessibility feature you have ever come across at a conference or otherwise, just in general? And if it is just in general, how do you think we can integrate these accessibility practices into conference spaces? Thank you.
So this is not an accessibility feature per se, maybe it's a practice, but I remember being at a talk at NYU where the microphones weren't working very well and the captioner wasn't set up or something like that. And it was Eli Clare who was talking, and Eli said, okay, we're going to pause. We're not going to continue until access is set up. And to me, that was so important because it was, you know, it was really modeling and demonstrating the importance of access, and also saying, you know, there are some things that are more important than this talk that I'm going to give. And so I really appreciated that. And I think that's something that people can do more broadly. I think access check-ins at the beginning of talks is super important at the beginning of panels. I think the organizers can really set the mood. So again, we're working within a conference space. We don't get to choose the room, right? We don't get to choose the lighting. We don't get to choose the sound, but we do get to choose how we proceed and don't proceed. And we can take the time to at least try to set things up as best as we can. And I think this question is as best as we can. And then what do we do when it's not enough? This is something that I struggle with a lot. Like, do you just not continue? Do you do something else entirely? This goes back to the high stakes, nature of things. And like, when do you decide not to continue? Or when do you decide to do something else completely? I don't have an answer for that. And it's something that I think a lot about.
This is Victor speaking. I was just going to pick up the point that Michelle made about that Eli Claire presentation, right, where Eli stopped. And I was thinking about our own experiences organizing that pre-con and how we're going to do it next year as well when we hold in Denver. And I think the challenge for us, which is not quite answering that question about innovative accessibility feature, but I think it's something that would be great if we can get around that issue, because I kind of feel that from an organizing perspective, right, you have to slot panels in, you have to slot speakers in, there's only that much time you can work with and that much space. So I think time and space is a premium. And I don't know how we can get around it. I'm not sure how we can do this. So I think for next year's conference, we're trying to like tone back and do things in a more laid back manner and have less speakers, more time. But I think the challenge is also how do we ensure that postgraduate students, early career scholars have time to do the things they need to do in high stake conferences like this. But yeah, I'm not sure how we can do this, but I think the challenge that I see as a conference organizer is time and space. And I would love to see suggestions on how we can do that.
This is Ruth. So I am going to show a picture that I think is a really neat accessibility feature, but it hasn't been framed as that. So let me just, it also responds to one of Christy's questions in the chats. I will give some context and then do an image description here. So in the 2019 SEAS conference, the organization put up a rather tall, I think maybe 5-foot tall banner sign that said, the SEAS convention is accessible. The SEAS convention has accessibility guides for the convention, quiet lactation and family rooms at conference sites, child care grants, gender neutral bathrooms. And as a group of us were sitting in the, I don't think there, there's an interpreter. Sorry, my caption was blocking the last word. So that's all printed on the sign. In a meeting with the Committee on Disability Issues in College Composition, people felt really hurt and unseen by this sign, because while these accessibility features were offered, this posturing of, hey, look, we're accessible, it invalidated and erased the experiences of inaccessibility that a lot of the conference goers were having and experiencing. So a really cool technology is the Post-it note. And we collected in that meeting, people wrote their experiences and frustrations with accessibility at the conference. And then we moved to the sign and posted them. People who walked by then participated. And so some of the signs read, there must be microphones for questions. Captioning and interpreting are not costs, they are necessities. The conference app is cumbersome and frequently crashes. speakers aren't providing access copies of their talks, I might as well not attend. CART at opening session was inaccessible. Offsite events did not provide access information. When people talk so fast, the interpreter captioner can't do their job. And there's more. And the reason I'm describing this as an accessibility feature is it goes back to what I was saying earlier about collective care and activism as a form of access. So what I was really, really moved by in seeing this, and at this point I can say being a part of this, was that we came together as a group and disrupted the dominant discourse of accessibility by the organization and foregrounded the lived experiences of disabled people and sick people and other forms of kind of vulnerability at the conference by plastering these on the signs. So I wanted to find a place to share this, and I'm like, this is a good time. I'm going to call this an accessibility feature, because the accessibility feature is that group activism, that collective storytelling, that testifying and testimony. That to me is what helps make changes for future conferences, that kind of collective organizing. And so I find in my research on conference accessibility guides and just accessibility at conferences, I find myself more and more interested in what people are doing to create access versus what the organizations are doing or not doing, because we have different priorities. Institutions, they're very focused on membership and profits. It is what it is. We live in capitalism. Sorry. I don't know why I'm saying sorry, as if I'm personally responsible for this, but and so that's what that's their end goal. And then, but the people, the members often have a different end goal, and that's a sense of community and sharing knowledge and sharing stories. And how do we as scholars, early, mid, late career scholars and makers of knowledge, create the space for us to do that?
Thank you so much. That was a great example. This is Pratiksha speaking. I'm going to share one of the attendee questions, which is, how can we consider language differences, especially of non-native English speakers, as part of accessibility conversations?
I mean, sorry if I feel like I'm going first constantly, so please, somebody jump in. I actually think about this a lot, and I do think it is an accessibility issue, and I think it can go in multiple ways. So this is an example where having access copies can really be helpful. It's also an example where slowing down helps everybody, where thinking about the jargon that we use is helpful. And I think it goes back to what Ruth said so brilliantly earlier, which is, thinking about what knowledge is and how we disseminate that knowledge in a conference presentation. And then how do we unpack or destruct or explode the category of the conference presentation to make it as accessible to all people, So that's my a take on that. And yes, I think absolutely it's very much a part of broader accessibility. And again, I really like the way that the DAF Labs statement included other kinds of access, and the way that Ruth also brought this up. And so this is a perfect example of, how we do need to think more broadly. So thank you.
This is Victor speaking, and I was just going to offer an added dimension to what Michele was saying, just because we were thinking about this issue when we were doing the Gold Coast conference. So I think one of the questions that came out among the organizers, the organizing committee for the disability pre-conference, was on sign language interpreters, right? Should we hire and should we have sign language interpreters right from the start? as a form of access. And then the other question that came out because of that was, what language should the sign language interpreters be in? So, I mean, for American-based conference, it's easy, right? It's ASL probably, so you don't have to bid. But for international conference, what language should it be in? Should it be in Auslan, where it's happening because that's where Gold Coast is? But then, ASL speakers don't speak Auslan, right? Or should it be in ASL? And then what if an Auslan speaker comes out? So we were saying, well, maybe we can try and see whether there are ISL speakers, WASLI certified ISL speakers, WASLI ISL interpreters based in Australia who could be on site. So we approached a couple that was listed and nobody replied. And I think in the end, we went with the approach that if people had access needs for interpreters, we would then offer. And I think that would be the kind of approach we take for sign language interpreters for the disability media and comms pre-con. But I just want to say that there are, I think, existing tensions around what language we offer as well, especially when it comes to interpreters.
Thank you. This is Ruth again. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I was thinking about how when we think about communication access, oftentimes it's framed in terms of CART and an ASL in the United States, at least interpreters, but ASL is a distinct language. It's not English signed, which I'm sure this group knows this. But so it's interesting how one form of language access is covered by, like, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and not necessarily in practice. It's not like there's ASL interpreters everywhere, but other forms of languages are not. And so something I just was thinking about, it would be really neat to see some more solidarity between different groups who, it's all under the umbrella of communication access. So I would be really interested to know more if that is something that has happened before, where different non-native English speakers of English, or just people who are multilingual, whether that is English and ASL or English and Spanish or English and something else, can collaborate and build solidarity in advocating for this. And the other thing I was thinking about is names. Something I really appreciated before everyone hopped on is Remy had all of us pronounce our names and spell them phonetically. I have been to multiple conferences where non-Western names were not just mispronounced. I think humans are human, but mispronounced, and then kind of out of embarrassment, the person laughed or said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and actually drew attention to it, which is a form of, that if we think of access as creating a culture of belonging, that does not foster a culture of belonging to be made to feel so othered. And so that was where my mind went when I heard this question, is names, and how can organizers and presenters make sure that they are pronouncing names correctly and not drawing attention to non-Western or kind of white names of awardees or top presenters, etc.
Remy speaking. So I just want to thank all three of you. What we're going to pivot to now are questions from attendees. So we've been keeping a record of things people have typed in the chat, but we also had some questions come in through the registration form as well. So for folks who are attending, please feel free to go ahead and type other questions in the chat. If you'd like us to call on you, if you'd like to verbalize your answer, like my dog in the background is doing right now, feel free to use the hand raise function and we can call on you. But to get us kicked off, I'm just going to pull one question that I think hasn't been addressed yet. And the question is, passing out copies of the presentation paper is one method, but people often have concerns about research theft. How do we balance and address those concerns?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a bullshit concern, because people can record a talk, people can do all kinds of things. And there are ways to, you can give out copies and ask to have them back. You can put a QR code or a link and then take it down. So these concerns about theft and the theft being specifically attached to the access copy as opposed to the talk in general seem to be very misguided to me.
This is Ruth, and I want to echo and also go, hey, No Face. I see your No Face avatar, Studio Ghibli fan. But yeah, I completely agree because there's so many ways. Something I do is I do write on my access copies, draft, or do not circulate. But that's also just because usually it's a really early draft, and I don't necessarily like it's for not because I'm worried about theft. It's because I'm just worried about awkward wording and not wanting someone to quote something or cite something that hasn't been really polished or thought through yet. So that's something, but again, that's less about preventing theft and more about me just saying, this is a very rough draft. So I appreciate the space to develop it.
And I totally get that. Just can say I totally get that people feel vulnerable. And especially if they're presenting work in progress, it can feel scary to give out copies, and I think again, leaning into that vulnerability and not using access copies as the hinge, or as the thing that that's the limit. It feels really problematic to me.
This is Victor speaking. I was just going to also echo Michelle's point, but also to say that I've stopped worrying about research theft, also because I've been moving my talk away from, dense theoretical stuff, academic research, to more writing them out as speaking notes rather than research articles in that sense, right? Even if in draft form. So I think I'm just less worried about that when I write in that form, and also to draw into Michelle's earlier point about preparing for presentations in a way that is accessible to folks. So writing them out as speaking notes instead of full-length draft articles, that allays a lot of fear from oneself as well.
And this is Remy speaking. So Rami from Detroit Disability Power has a hand up.
Hi, my name is Rami. I am a light brown non-binary person with a mustache, wearing some glasses. I have cropped short black hair, and I'm wearing a plaid overshirt under my gray shirt. And I just wanted to say thank you so much. I learned so much from the three of you today. Just was over here snapping and twiddling my fingers with my camera off as I multitask through my workday, 'cause ADHD. You were a lovely second screen of knowledge. So you all, spoke a lot to this thing that like some of us don't like, which is conferences, and the way like that they need to be, obviously, like I'm just restating the highlights here, that they need to be radically redesigned. And I wonder, like in many instances of like social change, at what point do we just say abolish? And like this way of sharing information with each other is not conducive at all. And it's going to be on disabled people, realistically, to do most of the labor of like making conferences accessible, so that non-disabled people can have an even more comfortable time totally taking it for granted and kind of like invisibilizing the great access they have, and what a lovely time they're now having. I often see that on the other end of access committees, there are disabled people who like aren't getting their needs met on the committee to design access. So I wonder, like, what does this do for you politically? Like, what are the power implications here, especially in this political moment? I think disabled people aren't seen as a powerful constituency by many elected people, or at least we don't get messaged to in the way other constituencies get messaged to. So what has this experience of being a disabled person constantly having your access needs not met at these conferences done for you politically? And, or you can answer one of these two, but it's like the same thing in a different package. What does a accessible conference post abolishing this way of conferencing look like? Like, what is your preferred way of meeting with peers of your study and exchanging information that excites each other and then partying? Because I'm guessing that's what a conference was intended to do, but then it ended up just being like a masturbatory fest of like funders getting, you know, whatever. I'm rambling, but I think the question, and anyone can take that.
This is Ruth. I'll go first on this one. And I don't mean to just be like I said earlier, but like I really think this goes back to that idea of something that I've taken away is that we have to reimagine the entire ecosystem of knowledge in academia because well, okay, I'll also say a dirty little secret. I like conferences. I like being in person. It is brave. I like having, because I do have a little bit of travel fund. I like being able to go and be in person with people who I don't usually see and explore new parts and new parts of the country. So I do like conferences. But also I acknowledge all the problems. And so, but I think this goes back to if we abolish conferences, and we go back, I love what you were saying to like, what is the core? Why do we do this? And that's to share knowledge. And how can we rebuild it in a way where it really is sharing works in progress? We're not just checking a checkbox. We're sharing it with people that we care about and that care about us and that are going to give us good feedback. We also need to destroy the idea of rigor because I think part of what it is, so, you know, 4Cs is the premier conference and it's considered, it's like, I think has a, I don't know, 25 to 33% acceptance rate. And so hiring committees and tenure committees are going to put more value on that than on me hanging out with my friends, spitballing ideas, even though that is actually going to be more generative and more knowledge making. So this goes back to this entire ecosystem has to change because this idea that exclusivity means more knowledge, more rigor is white supremacist, ableist, all of the ists, right? This whole idea that we have to be selective for it to really count. And so that, but to go back to that for people who are, you know, so the reason I'm still even invested in 4Cs is that I do know that when people go on job markets and when people go up for tenure, people are looking at those conferences and saying, did they go to the major conferences in their field? And until I can like make sure that all of those committees and all of those metrics of evaluating knowledge are updated and revised and abolished, then these places still carry so much weight. And politically, that makes me want to burn it down and also rebuild. And so I think that's what I have to say about that.
This is Victor speaking. Totally agree with Ruth. I was going to add that in Singapore, Nanyang Tech tends to feel that it's one of the top 20 schools and they want to compete with the Ivy Leagues. They want to be recognized as the Ivy League. So a key matrix that the president talks about every year is the QS ranking, what's the other one? I don't remember, but you know, the rankings, right? All the rankings, like whether or not we have reason in the rankings. And I think at the recent address, right, just to add to that need and talk about abolishing conferences, which is to say that at the recent address, it talked about wanting academics, faculty to only publish in the top 20% of journals. So I think the question of abolishing conferences must be linked to the question of, you know, what do journalists do as well, because they are all interrelated, right? It's not just about the top conferences, but also about quote unquote the top journals as well.
This is Remy speaking. So I think we probably have time for one more question, and I'm actually going to bundle together a couple of questions that had similar themes. So Emily, in the chat asked a question about access in an era of continuing COVID surges. As someone working with my local mask block, it's something I think and care about a lot, but I feel like there's been a lot of resistance to even making suggestions for best practices. And the related question to that was we also had a question asking about what the most requested but often forgotten support needs are for disabled people attending conferences.
Maybe I'll start, Victor, again. I'll start by answering the second question, which is what is the often forgotten and most requested access need coming from organizing an international conference. And I would say my thanks to Remy and the team also for checking in with me on what time works best for me. So I think before they even started, they checked in with me and asked me whether I prefer to present, like to have this in the morning or night. And I was like, oh, night is fine for me because the baby's asleep. So I'm happy to be in it. And I think that access need, right? When you're organizing international hybrid or virtual conference, where what time people are presenting in, that's an important question that we often neglect. And I think for me, from organizer, I think that's the question that a lot of people will come to me, and I'm glad that we managed to do that. I'm also saying this because I once presented at a conference in the States at 2 a.m. in Singapore, and I'm just like, I'm not functioning at that time. So, and nobody asked me at all whether or not that time worked for me. So,
I was going to say the mask issue is such an important one. So I'm really glad that this came up. And I really liked, again, going back to Ruth's very quotable quote of, when the institution fails, community prevails, because I do think, thinking institutionally, it's very hard to imagine some of these large conference organizations agreeing to have a mask mandate, and then that becomes about how do we create, communities of care and communities of accountability with people in those conferences. This is not about the mask, but I remember at a recent conference, I tried to go to a keynote and there was no captioning, and I just couldn't, and I was leaving. And then my close colleague and friend, Asali Dokumashi, who many of you probably know, said, well, if you can't go, I'm not going to go either, and we went out for ice cream and we had an amazing conversation about ideas, and this goes to what Ruth is saying too about the importance of conference being about the kinds of infrastructure that we create with each other and the kinds of ideas that we share with each other and how that does make our work better. So I do think, thinking about what, going to the mask issue and COVID surges, it's, what are we comfortable with and who are we bringing into our community to work with us on this?
This is Ruth. Thank you. Yes, yes. I was thinking about masking, something that it's also just being where you can sneak in. So again, 4 C's, sorry. They have, the statement that was very like, we welcome any individual who chooses to wear a mask, this kind of, and then so for the accessibility guide, which the committee was in charge of, we copied that, but then we also added and bolded, but because many of our members are high risk, the committee encourages masking as an act of care, shared responsibility, and protection. So finding ways that we can kind of sneak in that language, but I also think I was going to mention this as an accessibility feature, bringing masks to conferences, having it be available. I can't tell you how many times when people who are not wearing a mask see me wearing a mask and go, oh, I should be masking. And then actually being able to be like, here's a mask, or just go to the accessibility table, there's a mask there. So it's another form of, like Michelle was saying, creating the infrastructure with each other that we need. It does suck to be the only person masking. And then I was thinking about this question of access needs that are often not acknowledged, I think was that second part. And I don't know if it's always requested, but something I have noticed is food, issues around food are, gluten-free options available for folks with celiacs, and is food also just available on site throughout the entire period for people who just need it for like blood sugar reasons? And is there a grocery store close by? There wasn't a grocery store close by at Seas in Spokane, and so if people wanted to snack up on snacks, which is important for a variety of disabilities and also just like basic human survival, that was a real challenge. And then also thinking about how many social events revolve around alcohol at conferences. And so I think something that's really often overlooked are the accessibility needs of people in recovery and dealing with drug and substance abuse disorders. And so how can we create social events and networking and publisher parties that don't entirely just revolve around alcohol and drinking. And so that's something I'm trying to work on my campus. We usually have the Women's Caucus has a social at a bar, and I'm like, how about we do it at the women's basketball game instead? And people were really excited about that. And there will be alcohol, but it's not like the space, the venue is revolving around that. And this is really big, I think, in conference spaces at a lot of the parties and social events that are happening, is they're at bars and whatnot. So those are some overlooked access issues that would love to, and religious holidays. Okay, thank you.
And this is Remy speaking. So I have two quick questions for our panelists. One is, there was a question in the chat if you're comfortable sharing your social media handles or email addresses in case anyone wants to follow up. And I think the other is we're just about out of time. So I'm wondering if any of you might have like quick 30-second last minute things that you are burning to share before we disembark.
This is Ruth. I think the last thing I want to share is one of the most powerful things we can do is create the kind of spaces that we want to be in. And that is a lot of labor, to Victor's point earlier, and it's a labor of love. It is still labor. So I want to end just by thanking Disco for modeling the kind of accessibility with these multiple forms of this multiple practices, making sure our names are pronounced correctly, the captioning in the Zoom, but also in a separate link. I just really want to say I see that. I know it takes a lot to do that. So thank you for creating the spaces that we want to see and want to be a part of and modeling that. I'm really, really grateful to be here.
I agree with everything that Ruth said in terms of the work that you guys, you meaning Remy, Patricia, David, and choose to model what accessible webinaring conferencing looks like. So thank you so much for that. I would say I really think, we need to sort of think about, our expectations for conferences. And, I think what Ruth had said in terms of finding your people and also thinking about how we create para spaces within conferences that are nourishing and productive for us. I think that's really important. And also thinking about, what it is that we're using conferences for. And it's okay to not use conferences for going to panels and sitting and listening to papers for every or for any of the time. Use the conferences in ways that make sense for you.
This is Victor speaking. I think my last 30-second spiel would be to say that, it feels like I'm just talking about what I'm doing, but I've reiterated this a couple of times throughout what I'm sharing today is that a lot of the work that goes into organizing at ICA cannot happen without all the others who are supporting and working together. So this kind of labor, this kind of interdependencies, right, relying on each other, supporting each other as we organize. I think that's important to recognize as well.
This is Remy speaking, so I'm hoping we can all give the virtual equivalent of applause for Victor, Ruth, and Michele. We are going to save and collect the resources in the chat. And because folks have registered, I believe we'll be able to send those resources out to the full group as well. So I just want to thank everyone for attending, and also, again, profuse thanks to Vic, Ruth, and Michele for just taking the time and sharing your wisdom with us.
And I hope to be at a conference with everybody sometime soon. Yes. Cool. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. That was so fun. Thank you.
Yes. I hope we get to see all of you soon at some point.
Yes. And I would love to learn more. I'm going to go look at the DAF lab now because it seems so fabulous. So thank you.
Thank you. I feel like what was also really lovely about this conversation was it was a combination of folks attending from U of M, staff, students, and faculty, and students at the grad and undergrad level. But we also had folks from other universities attending as well as local disability organizations. So I just want to thank you all for talking with us. It was so fruitful.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
And Vic, would you like to stay